Hello, I'm Yousef Munayyer, head of the Palestine-Israel program and senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And I'm also your podcast host.
I'm Dr. Yara M, an assistant professor of global health management and informatics and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C.
Hi, this is Rami Khouri. I've been a journalist, analyst, writer in the Middle East and the Arab region and all over the place for the last almost 60 years.
Hi, I'm Hanna Alshaikh. I'm the Palestine Project Coordinator at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and I'm also a PhD candidate in History and Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University.
Welcome to another Hiwar episode of this podcast. Hiwar is the Arabic word for dialogue or discussion. And in each of these episodes, I, along with my Arab Center colleagues, discuss some of the big issues of the day. All right, welcome back, everyone. Well, the last time we had a chance to talk, we were awaiting the inauguration of the new president of the United States, Donald Trump. And now a little bit more than a month since he has taken office, we've got a chance to see some of the policies that the new Trump administration is rolling out. And this includes some big ideas, I guess we can say, regarding Israelis and Palestinians and Gaza in particular, as the White House has inherited a ceasefire agreement that was largely negotiated and finalized by the previous administration. And now we're starting to see perhaps that agreement begin to falter and fall apart. And I wanted to ask you, what's the latest that we are seeing with what is happening with this exchange deal and ceasefire, and what should we expect moving forward?
Yeah, Yousef, I would agree that the faltering of this deal was partially by design and partially inevitable due to Netanyahu's intransigence. But just as a recap, because it has been some time, one of the major points of phase one of what should be a three-phase ceasefire deal is that Israel was set to withdraw from parts of the Gaza Strip, most importantly, the Netzarim corridor, which cut the Gaza Strip in half, to allow the passage of residents of northern Gaza to return home safely. It also entailed a prisoner exchange of living prisoners on both sides, or hostages and prisoners on both sides. This was the first part, or the first phase of this deal. And the second phase was to deal with more longstanding issues. So there'd be an exchange of bodies of Palestinians and Israelis on both sides. But there would also be, and this is the critical point of contention for Israel, full Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in all areas, as well as some more longstanding issues about Gaza's future. So yes, in some ways, this was inevitable. There are serious challenges in transitioning to the second phase. If you were to ask Netanyahu this week, the reason that the prisoner exchange has been halted and 600 prisoners and their fate is looming in the balance is because of what Netanyahu describes as the humiliation of hostages, Israeli hostages that were released on Saturday. But prior to this moment, we had seen many instances in which Netanyahu had looked for other excuses to delay this deal. So that's something to know. And then we have confused messaging coming out of Washington. On the one hand, Steve Witkoff has really pushed for, or at least made gestures towards the importance of moving on to phase two, and has worked on securing regional alliances and pressure on Israel to move on to phase two. But at the same time, what also is happening is that Witkoff is saying, yes, if Netanyahu needs to extend phase one, we have to create the space and the time for that. So this is becoming a problem. And now we have something like 620 Palestinians awaiting their release. We have families that were waiting to receive them on Saturday. This was the international agreement with international backing. There's no legitimacy upon which Israel had the ability to do this. And on the other hand, we have Hamas, which is accusing Israel of violating humanitarian protocol. So there was supposed to be the entry of a certain amount of aid into Gaza. This has repeatedly been violated by Israel over and over again. And we shouldn't forget that there have been repeated attacks on Palestinians during this time as well. Israeli snipers have shot civilians more than once during the ceasefire period as well. And so another thing is that Hamas is also calling for international investigations about Israel's use of certain weapons. And so this is the status of where the negotiations are and why they seem to be stalled at this moment. And I do think later we'll be talking about the role of regional actors and Arab states and hoping to push for some sort of date after arrangement. And so we could talk about that later on as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Hanna. I think at the start of this ceasefire agreement, when it was first finally struck after so many months of negotiations and waiting, so much of the conversation and analysis following it centered around, well, we might be able to see phase one get executed, but the big question is whether or not there will be a will or an interest, particularly on the Israeli side, to move from phase one to phase two. And lo and behold, here we are at the tail end of phase one, and we're starting to see, the excuses and the failure to move forward with commitments from the Israeli side in the most prominent way now with this failure to release prisoners on schedule, as was agreed to. And of course, we know that while there have been violations of the ceasefire on the ground in Gaza, there's also been an escalation of violence directed at Palestinians in the West Bank. While so much of the attention has been on this exchange deal, there are really horrific things and in many ways unprecedented things happening in the West Bank. Yara, could you talk to us a little bit about what you are seeing take place in the West Bank and put it into some historic context for us as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really since 2022, I feel like we have witnessed this kind of creeping escalation of restriction and violence. I mean, even the Biden administration acknowledged the problem with settler violence that was unchecked. We saw in 2022 the closure of Nablus, which we hadn't seen in the West Bank for a long time. I mean, not that anything in the West Bank is just or runs as it should. There was a period of some semblance of normalcy. Like you could, feel comfortable at least driving to Bethlehem from Nablus, crossing the bridge between Jordan and the West Bank, etc. What we've seen, especially since October 7th, and especially in this new year, is a complete escalation on all fronts. You mentioned there's a lot of unprecedented stuff happening here. The current headline is, the first use of tanks in the West Bank, in the Jenin area, which is in the north, since the second Intifada. We've seen images from the camps that these are also the kind of tanks that destroy roads and, ensure lack of return. I'll touch on that in just a sec. We saw an increase from 2023 and 2024 in the number of home demolitions. Already in 2025, there's been 250 homes demolished. It's just now the end of February. We're seeing the largest mass displacement. So I think this is kind of the story. The largest mass displacement in the West Bank since 1967. An estimated 40,000 people, mostly from Jenin and Tulkarem, which are in the north, and specifically the refugee camps right on the outskirts. Around 40,000 people have been forced from their homes in extremely violent circumstances. And it wasn't just the people forced from their homes, but significant infrastructure was destroyed. We had even a picture of Netanyahu and some Israeli military members that had taken over a home in the Tulkarem camp for, some sort of strategic meeting. I mean, you hear stories about all of these things all the time. Like none of this is new. And I think that that's something we want to remember. This happened under Biden, Obama, both Bushes. This has been happening. This is the West Bank. It's settler violence. It's displacement. But what we're seeing in the past basically year and a half, I think at this point, there's no phrase for it except ethnic cleansing and essentially de facto annexation. Now, this has, again, West Bank citizens don't have, or civilians living in the West Bank, they're not Israeli citizens. They don't have rights. They haven't voted for 20 years. All of this has been true. What we're seeing now is a whole embrasure of this thought that Israel has claims that they will enact on all of historic Palestine. So we saw them demolish the Gaza Strip, push everyone to certain areas. In the West Bank, we're not seeing the same number of airstrikes, although there have been some, but we're seeing destruction, increase in movement restriction, people absolutely terrified to leave their homes and villages. Literally all the guardrails are off. So if this is not a pretext for annexation, and many Israeli ministers have essentially admitted that that's what it is, it's a really worrying time in the West Bank. And everyone I know that's there says this is the worst it's ever been, not even including this. I mean, including the second Intifada, this is the worst that it's ever been. It's really alarming.
Thank you, Yara. Over the past 100 years of this confrontation between the Zionist movement and Israel and the Palestinians, it's been a largely unidirectional dynamic. with Zionists taking land, forcing Palestinians off it. And while it has been unidirectional, we have seen multiple moments where there have been dramatic escalations of this dynamic. And it looks like we are witnessing that in the West Bank today over the last couple of years, but especially over the last couple of weeks as this campaign is moving forward and under the cover of what is taking place in Gaza, but also elsewhere throughout the region as there has been a lot of change. Rami, I want to ask you about what we are seeing in Lebanon now, what we are seeing in Syria. Of course, there is a new government now in Syria that is trying to move in some way towards transitional governance, cobbling together Syrian sovereignty again. And of course, that is under attack from a lot of different directions. And in Lebanon, the funeral of Hassan Nasrallah, as well as other figures in Hezbollah yesterday, drawing massive crowds. What can you tell us about what is transpiring and what it means to the north of Palestine?
I think what you're seeing in Lebanon and Syria now is part of what you mentioned, Yousef, as the century-long span of the conflict we're seeing in Palestine, which is two states that were imagined in the minds of European colonial powers in the 1920s. Lebanon and Syria are now yet again in the process of redefining themselves, both because of internal friction and external intervention and manipulation and involvement. And the fascinating thing is how the external actors evolved over time. Back then in the 20s, it was the British and the French mostly, and the Russians tried to play around the edges in the north a bit. But now recently it was the Iranians who were very involved and the Israelis who were very involved. So there's a constant dynamic going on in these countries, in these two, Lebanon and Syria, which is really a microcosm of the modern Arab state, which is that these states are still being born and trying to define themselves. The fascinating thing in Syria is that this has happened in the wake of a popular uprising, which had a lot of external support. Again, ironically, Israel, Turkey, Qatar, others were involved, and the U.S., they all played a role in pushing this process forward. But the fascinating thing is that what's going on in Syria is one of the few processes where Syrians themselves may have the opportunity to shape their future, define their government and values and policies. This has not really ever happened seriously in the Arab world. In places where Arab independent countries all over the region were independent and took some policies, decisions. If they upset some of the big powers, then suddenly those leaders were overthrown or there was a war or something. So we're really still looking for the example of a genuinely self-determinant Arab citizenry. We almost had one in Tunisia in 2012, 13, 14, and it worked for a few years, and then the old guard came back. So that's the big picture, that for various reasons, these two countries are trying to remake themselves, but they're doing so in a context of mass pauperization, huge vulnerabilities to Israeli power and other external forces, and multiplicity of internal actors, including armed actors. In Syria, this is very dynamic because you've got actors who are supported by the US or by Turkey or by Iran or by Israel or the US, all kinds of people. So that's the big picture. And it's not going to be quick to resolve itself. You're getting now the president of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara, who's going to attend the Arab Summit. That's symbolically very significant. Whether he, in fact, is the president of all of Syria is not yet clear, because you've got massive problems in terms of integrating all the groups who have lived more or less independently, the Kurds, the Alawites, the Druze, the different groups in different parts of the countries, big tribal groups in the south, all of them supported by other powers, and massive poverty, highly deficient infrastructure in both countries, But at the same time, there is a countervailing force to this, which is a really clear popular will, a human sentiment to find that dignity that comes with self-determination and defining your own state, your own values, your own government system. So we're at the very early stages of this process, and it's going to take some time. In Lebanon, you've got the added factor that you really had Hezbollah as the main force politically and economically and militarily in the country, and then you had everybody else with the decline of the Christian forces and the Sunni forces, politically and militarily. But Hezbollah has taken a hit, so they're still strong, but they're not as strong as they used to be. People are no longer afraid of them and challenge them more openly politically. And we've seen signs of this with the new Nawaf Salam government. So there's a political reconfiguration going on internally in the parliament and the cabinet and all that, as well as in its external relations with the Israelis and the Iranians and others. One of the big deficiencies that Lebanon suffers is the same one as Palestinians in Gaza suffer, is that the alleged external mediator in the ceasefire is also the supporter of the Israeli military aggression. The Israelis are supported by the Americans, and the Americans are supposed to mediate these two ceasefires. So there's a structural problem there. And that, again, reminds us of the 100-year time span, that we have to use this 100-year time span to really understand these processes, because we've continued to have Western colonial, imperial, whatever we want to call it, impulses that want to shape our region, not necessarily own it, but shape it in their interests. And we're still seeing this with what the U.S. is doing. The French are trying to play a role. The British have pretty much given up. And now we still have to deal with the problem that the biggest supporter of Israel is also supposed to be the mediator that brings justice to both sides, in Lebanon and Israel, and in Palestine and Israel. And that's not very realistic. And that's why there's still a lot of popular resistance to accepting a bad Israeli deal. That the alternative is that the Palestinians keep suffering, which is not an easy alternative. But this is something for history to sort out.
Thank you, Rami. I want to zoom back in for a moment to Palestine before zooming back out to the region and asking you all a question about that. You know, one of the things that's most striking about the current moment, especially over the last several weeks, is, you know, even though the Zionist movement, by the very nature of its objectives, has always sought to displace and dispossess Palestinians, never before has the call for such a policy been so loud and clear. And it's now being stated as a matter of policy from all corners of Israeli society as a desired objective by present day leaders to former leaders to opinion shapers to just people all over social media. The call for mass displacement, ethnic cleansing, and the mass killing of Palestinians, genocidal violence, is something that has become extremely commonplace. And this is something that was pushed forward by the call of President Donald Trump recently, where he talked about, displacing the Palestinian population of Gaza, and then the United States somehow owning the Gaza Strip after that and turning it, in his words, into a Riviera on the Mediterranean, as if, this was not a human rights catastrophe or a national struggle, but, a real estate deal between a couple mafiosos. But here we are. And this is sort of the context in which leaders of the region are engaging with the Trump administration. And after Benjamin Netanyahu came here as the first foreign leader to visit President Trump, King Abdullah from Jordan came to visit the White House. And he had a very difficult meeting that was widely discussed afterwards, particularly in the Arab world. And then it seemed that the Egyptian president, who was slated at some point to visit, said, I'm not doing that. And the Arabs were then tasked by Donald Trump with coming up with a better plan. We're going to be seeing an Arab League meeting soon. How are we thinking about how Arab regional leaders are responding to this moment where the president of the United States is calling for the mass displacement of Palestinians in Gaza?
You know, this whole thing with Trump and the future of Gaza and the Palestinians there is quite an extraordinary dynamic, but it's not out of character with both the Israeli and the Western tradition of addressing the Palestinians as if they don't exist. Their land is not theirs. They as people don't have any rights. So it's for Trump, it's like a monopoly game. You move these people around, you buy this property, you invest here. But the fascinating thing to me was what happened about 10 days ago. There were two things that happened right in a row. The first one was when Hamas held its ground and said, we're not releasing these captives on Saturday until the Israelis fulfill their obligations. And this created a lot of noise. But then 2 days later, the Israelis agreed. They said, okay, we will. So they did most of what they're supposed to do, letting more humanitarian aid, letting people move more freely. That was fascinating. And it was a sign that when people take a certain position and it's a legitimate position, it might hurt you in the short run, but in the long run, it'll elicit a response from the other side, even if the other side's much stronger than you are. And the same thing happened with Trump, I think, with his plan for Gaza. He made this outrageous proposal. Jordan and Egypt predictably turned it down. And then they quickly started talking to the Saudis and coming up with a better plan. The fascinating thing there, I think, is that we don't know how sincere the Saudis are, how comprehensive the plan is going to be in its support by Arab countries. Probably it'll be a kind of stepping stone to Arab Peace Plan version 2, which will be backed by 57 Muslim majority countries. And the real dynamics of this process are still to be clear. They're not, but what we've seen so far is, I think, really important. Like when Hamas stood its ground and forced the Israelis to make some concessions, the Egypt, Jordan, Saudi, and then others will be joining them, are going to come up with a plan that they say can rebuild Gaza without expelling the Palestinians. If this is correct, I think it has two significant dimensions. One is that you do have some kind of joint Arab position. We'll see how joint it is and if it holds, but I think for the moment it looks okay. The second, more important one is that the Saudis are taking the lead on this in many ways now. And this is something the Saudis have been reluctant to do for years. They are potentially the most powerful Arab country in many ways, but they've always been reluctant to be the leader of the Arabs. They did it with the oil boycott way back in 1973, and they did it with the peace plan in 2002. But this is now a sign that perhaps Mohammed bin Salman has learned his lessons about how leadership works. He made a few decisions when he was first king that didn't work really well. The war in Yemen, encircling the Qataris, kidnapping the Lebanese prime minister, killing Khashoggi. These things the Saudis did created terrible negative responses from all over the place. And I think they've matured to some extent. And this is a sign of perhaps a new kind of Saudi intervention or engagement in the region. I think they have understood that if the region continues along its present path with wars and civil wars and foreign intervention and the Iranians, Israelis firing at each other, this is only going to be a catastrophe for them, because it's only a question of time till their oil fields are hit and people. These are the two things that I find so fascinating: the joint Arab action and the Saudi leadership, both of which respond to initiatives by the two most powerful and destructive forces in the region, which is Israel and the United States.
I just wanted to very briefly jump, on what Rami said, and just, what we're talking about at this point, the Arab nations having to come together to rebuild Gaza, to figure out what's going on with the Palestinians. And even the fact that we're at this stage and we're again, leaning on these actors is so just unbelievably frustrating. I know, the Arab Peace Initiative has been ostensibly on the table since the early 2000s, but, there's never been a real emphasis on protecting Palestinian life, on having any accountability for Israel in any meaningful way, or on pushing the U.S. with any meaningful levers. So to now they're having these conversations about the future of the Palestinians. It's just, I don't know what this means, but it's just incredibly frustrating. And the challenge is much more difficult than it would have been at any of those previous points. Now we have a Gaza Strip that's estimated to need at least $50 billion to rebuild. So the Egyptians, from what I read, and they have this plan for a 3-year rebuilding. This was a World Bank report that needed $50 billion over 10 years. So even optimistically, where's that money going to come from? And without a political resolution, who's going to invest that if Israel is just going to be able to do this again, especially now with the U.S. administration for at least the next 4 years that is totally fine with ethnic cleansing. And then there's the governance question. So in none of these plans, I don't think, the Arab plan and Netanyahu himself, of course, the Israelis, they will not acquiesce to a long-term plan with Hamas in any position of power. The Palestinian Authority has claimed that it's ready to govern, but the Palestinian Authority, and I neglected to mention earlier, has been part of the same crackdown in the West Bank and has killed multiple Palestinians since the beginning of this year, and in fact raided the Jenin camp just weeks before the Israelis did. And of course, do not secure Palestinians against Israelis. They only secure the order that pays for and justifies their existence. They have no credibility in the West Bank, let alone now are they going to be somehow tasked with governing the Gaza Strip. So until we can get past these issues of who's going to pay for it and who's going to govern meaningfully, and how can we prevent this from happening again? We cannot go back to this occupation blockade limbo that we've been in for so long. I would really like to see some meaningful engagement with that, and not just let's put together an economic package. We've been there, done that.
We've also alluded a lot to historical patterns throughout our conversation today. And I'm noticing with horror how so many of these, what are really mass expulsion plans and schemes that Israel cooks up and then the international community often legitimizes, are really forms of enticement to hide ethnic cleansing. So, for example, the late 1950s, there was something called the Hammarskjöld Plan. So in order to entice Palestinian refugees whose fate was still in limbo, a number of Arab states were incentivized, if they were to accept huge aid packages to provide citizenship to Palestinians in those states in exchange for the relinquishing of their right of return, as stipulated, as safeguarded under international law. Not only did Arab states reject this plan, but Palestinian refugees organized against this in places like Lebanon and elsewhere against these sorts of schemes. So it's not the first time that the international community would ever entertain such a thing. And it's not the first time that Palestinians deal with something like this, but it's striking that in a moment where Israel is emboldened and the lesson that it took from its genocide in Gaza, if you were to ask somebody like the Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, is to say, when he looks at Jenin and Tulkarem, to say that he's going to turn it into Jabalia and Shuja'iyya. So this is the lesson that these states are, a state like Israel and the United States are learning from this. And they are trying yet again to incentivize regional actors to solve this problem, to close the refugee question for good, to close these big questions about Palestinian statelessness and Palestinian colonial subjugation, to end them for good, and to incentivize other states using the instruments of the international community that are not intended for this, at least in theory. And so it's just, I think, quite horrifying to see these patterns at play again. And while the Palestinians have persisted for almost 100 years or over 100 years, it's no less daunting, especially in the, what we hope is the aftermath of a genocide. Although, again, I should add that Netanyahu said that he's ready to return to war at any time.
And I think it's important here to point out, too, that we've heard some things from officials in Arab governments that are no less belligerent. We've heard the Jordanian foreign minister talk about the displacement of Palestinians from the West Bank into Jordan as being cause for war. And we've heard similar statements from Egyptian officials around this as well. It seems like the major sticking point right now, as it has always been, is what to do with the Palestinian national question. And obviously, from the Israeli perspective, they would like to see the entire region move forward, agreeing to eliminate the Palestinian national question in its entirety. While the Arab states understand, whether they agree or not with many different Palestinian perspectives, that there are tremendous costs to that directly for them and the region if they participate in it. And part of this back and forth, in my view, is an effort to demonstrate to the world, but also to the White House, that the sticking point here is the Israeli government, and in particular, the man that sits atop of it, that he is more of an obstacle. And it's, I think, part of the reason why you're seeing a number of different Arab countries come together to propose all of these different alternatives and plans and invest a tremendous amount of money, making clear that they're ready to take steps. They're ready to do something. But as you all pointed out, that political question, what is the mechanism? Who governs Gaza? Will the Israelis agree to it? Those are the major outstanding questions that we don't have answers to. And I think part of this is, as I said, the Arab states wanting the White House to realize who's preventing that question from being resolved. So we'll probably leave it here for today, but when we talk next time, we'll probably know more about what happens between phase 1 and phase 2, what the outcome of this Arab League meeting is, and we'll keep an eye on what is taking place in the West Bank and elsewhere in the region as well. Thank you all for joining us again.